On a crisp autumn afternoon in New York Central Park, a 10-year-old boy stood alone, playing his violin, a cherished heirloom from his late grandfather. Instead of applause, he faced cold stares and whispered judgments about his worn clothes and scruffy appearance. 2 park security officers approached, seized the violin, smashed it to pieces before his eyes, and escorted him and his mother to their office. Unbeknownst to them, his mother was a high-ranking NYPD official, and their actions would soon unravel in ways they never expected. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The late afternoon sun poured through the towering oaks of Central Park, casting golden patches across the winding paths and sprawling lawns of the sheep meadow. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor. Families lounged on checkered picnic blankets. Kids raced around the Bethesda fountain, their laughter echoing, while joggers weaved through the crowd, their breaths puffing in the autumn chill. Couples strolled hand in hand, and street performers dotted the paths, their music blending into the vibrant hum of the park. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed to belong, except for Ethan. He stood near the edge of the meadow, away from the bustling playground and the cheerful chatter, clutching a worn violin case that looked out of place among the polished surroundings. 10 years old, with pale skin freckled from too many Brooklyn summers, sandy brown hair poking out from under a faded Mets cap, and a threadbare jacket hanging loose over scuffed sneakers, Ethan blended into the background. His jeans were frayed at the cuffs, his backpack patched with duct tape. A kid who looked like he'd seen better days, like he didn't quite fit in this manicured world. But today, he wanted to be heard. Ethan opened the case with careful hands, revealing the old violin, its wood scratched and dulled from years of love and use. It had belonged to his grandfather, a man who'd filled their cramped Brooklyn apartment with music, his deep voice humming along as he taught Ethan to play. "Play like you're telling the world who you are, kid," he'd said, his calloused hands guiding Ethan's small fingers across the strings, showing him how to coax beauty from the worn instrument. His grandfather was gone now, taken by illness last spring, but the violin remained, a piece of him, warm and alive in Ethan's hands. He tucked it under his chin, his heart thudding against his ribs, and lifted the bow. The first note wavered, unsteady in the open air, but he pressed on, the melody growing clearer, a soulful tune that drifted across the meadow, catching the breeze and weaving through the park's lively pulse. A few kids nearby paused their game of tag, their curious eyes fixed on Ethan. One girl, maybe 7, with pigtails and a bright red scarf, lingered closest, clutching a soccer ball as she tilted her head to listen. Her eyes sparkled with wonder, and she offered a shy smile, as if the music spoke to her in a way words couldn't. Ethan caught her gaze and managed a small nod, his fingers steadier now, the notes flowing smoother. Further back, the adults were less kind. A man in a crisp polo shirt and sunglasses leaned toward his wife, his voice carrying over the grass like a sharp blade. "Who let this kid set up here? Probably begging for tips," he muttered, loud enough for Ethan to hear. His wife, in a designer sweater and pearl earrings, nodded, clutching her purse tighter. "Bet his parents are just waiting to scam someone," she added, her tone dripping with disdain. Ethan's fingers faltered, the bow scraping slightly, but he clung to his grandfather's voice in his mind, letting the music pull him back. He'd heard these words before, the assumptions about his patched clothes, his messy hair, the way he didn't fit their polished image of Central Park. Still, he played, the notes rising stronger, a shield against the whispers that cut deeper than he'd ever admit. But the music couldn't drown out the heavy footsteps approaching. 2 park security officers, their badges glinting on dark uniforms, zeroed in on him from across the meadow. Their faces were hard, their strides purposeful, their radios crackling faintly with static. Ethan's stomach sank, a cold knot tightening in his chest. He knew that look. They weren't here to listen. They were here to make him stop. The footsteps crunched closer, sharp against the meadow's soft hum. Ethan's fingers froze mid-note, the melody dissolving into the crisp air. His heart pounded louder than the music ever could, thudding in his ears as he kept the violin under his chin, the bow trembling in his grip. His grandfather's words echoed faintly, stubborn but fading. Play like you're telling the world who you are. But not here. Not now. "Hey, kid!" a rough voice barked. Ethan stiffened as the taller officer loomed beside him, his uniform crisp, his badge catching the fading sunlight. His partner stood a few steps back, arms crossed, eyes scanning Ethan like he was a misplaced item in a tidy store. "What do you think you're doing out here?" the first officer demanded, his gaze flicking to the violin with suspicion, as if it were evidence of a crime. Ethan's throat tightened, his words catching somewhere deep in his chest. His palms sweated against the violin's worn wood, the familiar grain grounding him even as his voice shook. I'm just playing music, sir," he stammered, barely above a whisper, his eyes darting to the ground. "Playing music," the officer repeated, his tone thick with doubt, as if the idea were absurd. He sized Ethan up, the faded Mets cap, the patched jacket, the scuffed sneakers, his eyes narrowing as if Ethan's presence offended the park's order. "You here alone?" he pressed, his voice sharp, impatient. Ethan hesitated, his mind racing. His mom was nearby, probably finishing a call or grabbing coffee from a vendor near the fountain, trusting him to practice as they'd planned. He'd promised her he'd stay out of trouble, just play his music and keep to himself. But his silence only sharpened the officer's suspicion, the man's brow arching as he waited for an answer. Before Ethan could find his voice, a sharp comment cut in from the crowd. "Been watching him for a while," the man in the polo shirt called out, arms folded, sunglasses perched on his head like a crown. "First it's music, then they're asking for cash. Typical street kid," he said, his voice loud and accusing, as if Ethan were a problem to be swept away. Ethan's stomach twisted, his grip tightening on the violin. He kept his eyes down, avoiding the man's gaze, but the words landed like a punch. The officer nodded slowly, as if the man's accusation confirmed something he'd already decided. "That so?" the officer asked Ethan, his voice flat, unreadable. Ethan shook his head, his voice cracking as he forced the words out. "I wasn't asking for money. I was just playing." His eyes flicked to the girl with the red scarf, still watching from a distance, her soccer ball now forgotten on the grass, her small brow furrowed, her expression a mix of confusion and sympathy, as if she sensed something wasn't right. The taller officer stepped closer, his shadow falling over Ethan, heavy and oppressive. "We've had complaints," he said, his tone cold, final. "You can't just loiter here, bothering people." Ethan's chest burned, panic rising as the adults' whispers grew louder, their voices sharp as glass. "Probably stole that violin," a woman in a navy coat muttered, her words carrying across the meadow. Ethan wanted to run, to scream, to find his mom, but he was rooted, the officers closing in, the crowd's judgment pressing down like a weight he couldn't shake. Suddenly, the taller officer grabbed the violin's neck. "Let's see it," he snapped, yanking it from Ethan's small hands. Ethan lunged forward, clutching the instrument, his voice breaking in desperation. "Please, it's mine. It was my grandpa's." The bow clattered to the ground as he fought to hold on, his fingers digging into the wood, but the officer's grip was stronger, ripping the violin free. Ethan stumbled forward, his heart hammering as the officer turned the instrument over, inspecting it like evidence in a case he'd already judged. "Beat up old thing," the officer muttered, weighing it in his hand with a skeptical frown. Ethan's breath hitched, his chest tight with fear and grief. It wasn't just a thing, it was his grandfather's laughter, his stories, the late nights in their apartment filled with music. The officer glanced at the growing crowd, their judgmental stares and whispered comments fueling him. His partner smirked, shaking his head. "Guess the show's over, kid," he said, his voice low and mocking. Without warning, the officer raised the violin and slammed it against the pavement. The crack of splintering wood echoed like a gunshot across the meadow. Gasps rippled through the crowd, a few phones raised to capture the moment. The violin's delicate body shattered, strings snapping, pieces skidding across the ground. Ethan's knees buckled, and he dropped to the pavement, his hands scrambling for the fragments. Tears stung his eyes, spilling hot down his freckled cheeks as he gathered the broken wood, his sobs raw and loud, cutting through the park's lively hum. The officers stood over him, unmoved, their boots planted firm, their faces blank. The girl with the red scarf stepped back, her eyes wide with shock, clutching her ball tighter as her mother pulled her away. The crowd's whispers grew louder, some filming with their phones, others muttering in quiet satisfaction. Ethan barely heard them, his world narrowing to the jagged pieces in his hands, the splintered wood, the snapped strings, the shattered memory of his grandfather's music. The park's warmth faded, replaced by the cold weight of judgment, the sneers, the broken notes, and the sound of his own grief filling the space where his song used to be. Then, her footsteps cut through the noise, steady and deliberate, like a storm gathering strength. Laura Bennett didn't look like power at first glance. In her dark slacks and simple blazer, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, she blended into the park's crowd. But her eyes, sharp, unyielding, like polished steel, stopped people cold. Ethan didn't see her at first, his hands clutching the violin's remains, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. But the officers noticed. The taller one, who'd smashed the violin, stiffened as Laura approached, her face calm, but her presence heavy, radiating an authority that made the air feel thinner. The meadow fell quiet, the crowd's murmurs fading. "What do you think you're doing?" Laura's voice was low, slicing through the tension like a blade. The taller officer's jaw twitched, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "We've got this handled, ma'am," he said, the word laced with mockery, as if she were just another bystander to dismiss. Laura's gaze didn't flinch. "It doesn't look handled," she said, her tone steady, cutting. The second officer shifted, his boredom giving way to unease, his arms uncrossing as he glanced at his partner. Ethan looked up, his tear-streaked face meeting his mother's steady eyes. Relief flooded him, mixed with shame, anger, and the raw ache of loss. She was here, and that was enough to loosen the knot in his chest, if only a little. The officer smirked, undeterred. "Your kid?" he asked, tilting his head. Laura nodded, slow and deliberate, her eyes never leaving his. "Then maybe you should have kept an eye on him," he said, his voice sharp. "He's been causing a disturbance, loitering, making people uncomfortable." Laura's eyes flicked to the broken violin in Ethan's hands, then back to the officer, her expression unreadable. "Playing music is a disturbance now?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with steel. "We had complaints," the officer snapped, gesturing to the shattered instrument with a careless wave. "Show's over." Laura's jaw tightened, but her composure held, unshaken. She scanned the crowd, the man in the polo shirt smirking smugly, the woman in the navy coat whispering to her friend, the girl with the red scarf now clinging to her mother's hand, her eyes still fixed on Ethan with quiet sympathy. Some filmed with their phones, others watched with curiosity or discomfort. their faces a mix of judgment and anticipation. Laura saw it all, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She knelt beside Ethan, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, her voice softening just enough for him to hear. "You okay?" she asked, her tone warm but steady. Ethan swallowed hard, his voice small and cracked. "It was Grandpa's violin," he whispered, his fingers clutching the broken pieces tighter. A flicker of pain crossed Laura's face, a brief crack in her calm, but she buried it quickly, her resolve hardening. She stood, facing the officers again, her posture straight, her gaze piercing. "I want your badge numbers," she said, her voice low but commanding. The taller officer laughed, a short, dismissive bark, shaking his head. "One of those, huh?" he muttered, pulling himself up straighter. "Gonna tell me this is all unfair? Your kid's a saint, and we're the villains?" His partner snorted, exchanging a glance, feeding off the crowd's attention. "Look, lady," the taller officer continued, tilting his head toward Laura. "This isn't a stage for your kid to beg on. It's a public park, and we're keeping it safe." Laura didn't blink. Her silence was heavier than any retort, a quiet force that made the officer's smirk falter for a fraction of a second. She took a slow breath, the kind that signaled something big was coming. "You're responsible for destroying private property," she stated, her voice even, cold and precise. The officer rolled his eyes, unfazed. "It's junk," he snapped. "An old violin, please." Laura's gaze sharpened, her voice dropping lower, colder. "It wasn't junk to him," she said, each word deliberate, cutting through the air like a warning. The officer's smirk wavered, but his partner cut in, his tone mocking. "Ma'am, we've got procedures for this. You want to file a complaint? Fine. But you and your kid are coming with us. We'll sort it out at the office." Laura's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing slightly. The crowd shifted, whispers rippling through them like static. Phones still raised, waiting for her to back down or push back. But Laura wasn't built to fold. She reached into her blazer pocket, pulling out her wallet with smooth, practiced movements. Her thumb brushed over something inside, but she didn't reveal it yet. "Fine," she said simply, her tone not surrender but strategy. "We'll go to the office." The officer nodded, his smugness returning, as if he'd won something. Laura helped Ethan to his feet, her hand firm on his shoulder, a quiet reassurance against the storm in his chest. Ethan clutched the broken pieces of the violin, their jagged edges pressing into his palms like fragile bones. The crowd's eyes followed as they walked across the meadow, the park's warmth fading into a tense, heavy silence. The girl with the red scarf watched, her mother pulling her away, but her small face lingered in Ethan's mind, a flicker of kindness in the sea of judgment. The officers led the way, their strides confident, unaware of the storm they'd just invited. The security office was a short walk across the park, but the journey felt endless. Ethan sat in a stiff metal chair, the broken violin pieces cradled in his lap, his reflection faint in the office's smudged window. His freckled face was pale, his eyes red from crying, his lips pressed tight to keep the shaky breaths inside. Laura sat beside him, her posture straight, her face carved from stone, radiating a calm that felt like it could bend the world. The officers barely spoke, the taller one glancing back with a smirk, as if this was just another routine task to check off. The office was stark, metal desks cluttered with papers, flickering fluorescent lights, the faint smell of stale coffee and worn-down authority. They were told to wait, the seconds stretching into minutes, the clock on the wall ticking louder than anything else in the room. Ethan's throat was dry, his legs dangling just above the floor, but Laura's hand on his shoulder kept him anchored, a steady tether against the fear clawing at his chest. Then the door at the end of the hallway opened, and the air shifted. Captain Daniel Hayes, head of park security, stepped through, his badge catching the flickering light. He wasn't tall or imposing, but his presence carried weight, until his eyes landed on Laura. His confidence drained like water from a cracked glass, his mouth parting slightly, his shoulders stiffening. He knew her. Ethan didn't know how or why, but the shift in the room was unmistakable. "Laura," Hayes greeted, his voice low, threaded with unease. Ethan's head snapped up, confusion flashing across his tear-streaked face. Laura rose slowly from her chair, her posture composed, her eyes steady as polished glass. "I want to know exactly what your officers think they're doing, harassing a child, destroying his property, and dragging us here like suspects," she said, her words sharp, precise, without a hint of a tremble. The room went quiet, the ticking clock suddenly deafening. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, his smirk gone, his arms uncrossing as he watched the exchange unfold. Hayes swallowed, his throat bobbing, his gaze darting from Laura to Ethan, to the broken violin pieces in the boy's hands, and back again. "They didn't know," he said, the words stumbling, awkward, strained. "Clearly," Laura replied, her voice colder than the room itself. She reached into her blazer, retrieving her ID with calm, practiced ease, flipping it open for Hayes and the others to see. Ethan caught a glimpse, the NYPD crest, the bold lettering, the title beneath her name. Deputy Inspector, Internal Affairs. The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating. Hayes's face drained of color, his eyes widening slightly. The taller officer's bravado cracked, his shoulders sagging as realization hit like a wave. Laura snapped the ID shut and slipped it back into her pocket with a smooth motion. "Where's the footage?" she asked flatly, her tone leaving no room for hesitation. Hayes blinked, caught off guard. "Your body cams," Laura clarified, one brow arching just enough to slice through the tension. "You record everything. Let's see it." Hayes hesitated for only a second before snapping into action, barking quiet orders to the officers nearby. The taller officer returned minutes later, holding a tablet, his earlier swagger replaced by a tense, wide-eyed look Ethan had only seen on grown-ups, who knew they'd messed up badly. Laura took the device, her eyes flicking over the screen as the video played. It was silent, but the footage spoke louder than words. Ethan watched himself on the screen, small and nervous, violin in hand, playing his grandfather's melody. He saw the officers approach, the man in the polo shirt pointing and complaining, the woman in the navy coat whispering accusations. He saw the taller officer rip the violin from his hands, saw it shatter against the pavement, the pieces scattering like broken dreams. Ethan's chest tightened, his fingers clutching the fragments in his lap as the footage ended. Hayes's face darkened, his jaw tight as the video stopped. The room was dead silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Laura handed the tablet back with slow, deliberate movements, her eyes never leaving Hayes. "I expect full cooperation with the investigation," she said, her voice even, authoritative. "And I expect both of your officers suspended immediately, pending review." Hayes didn't argue. His jaw tightened, his shoulders stiff as he nodded, his voice clipped. "Understood." Laura glanced briefly at Ethan, her expression softening for the first time since they'd arrived, a flicker of warmth breaking through her steel calm. Then her eyes returned to Hayes, sharp and steady. "This isn't just about a broken violin," she said quietly, her words carrying the weight of a promise. "It's about what you let happen in broad daylight, in a public park, in front of families, in front of my son." The room stayed quiet, no one daring to interrupt. Ethan's chest loosened just a little, the fear that had gripped him since the meadow easing for the first time. He didn't know exactly what came next, but with his mother's calm strength beside him, he wasn't scared anymore. They had no idea who they'd crossed, but they did now. 3 days later, the music shop on West 57th Street smelled of polished wood, rosin, and the faint hum of a cello drifting from a back practice room. Ethan trailed behind his mother, the bell above the door jingling softly as they stepped inside. The memory of the broken violin haunted him, the splintered wood, the snapped strings, the sound of his grandfather's music shattering against the pavement like something inside him broke too. But Laura's steady presence grounded him, her promise to make things right, a quiet anchor in the storm of the past few days. Ethan clutched a small paper bag in his hands, holding the largest salvaged piece of his grandfather's violin, its weight both a comfort and a reminder of what was lost. The shopkeeper, an older woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes behind wire-framed glasses, greeted them with a warm smile. "Ms. Bennett? I have what you called about," she said, her gaze softening as it landed on Ethan. He stood close to his mother, his faded cap pulled low, his backpack slung over one shoulder, the nervous clutch of the paper bag betraying the ache in his chest. The shopkeeper's smile faltered slightly, not out of judgment, but sympathy, as if she sensed the weight he carried. Laura nodded, her voice calm but firm. "For my son." The shopkeeper led them to a display near the counter, where rows of violins gleamed under warm lights, their polished surfaces reflecting the shop's cozy glow. Ethan hesitated, his feet rooted to the floor as his eyes scanned the instruments. They were beautiful, perfect, untouched, their wood smooth and unscarred. But they weren't his violin. They didn't carry his grandfather's scratches, the faint initials carved inside the neck, the little dents from years of music and love. His fingers curled tighter around the paper bag, the broken fragment inside pressing against his palm like a memory he couldn't let go. Laura knelt beside him, her voice lower now, gentle but steady. "I know it's not the same," she said, her eyes meeting his, understanding the pain he didn't voice. "But it's a start, Ethan. A new beginning." Ethan's throat tightened, his chest aching with the weight of loss and hope tangled together. He wanted to believe her, to reach for one of those shiny new violins and feel whole again. But the fear lingered. The whispers, the smirks, the sound of the wood splintering in the park, the way the officers looked at him like he didn't belong, like he never would. "It's just a violin," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of the words. Laura shook her head slowly, her hand resting warm on his shoulder. "No," she corrected, her voice soft but certain. "It's a promise." She reached for the paper bag, her fingers gentle over his, guiding him to open it. Inside, carefully wrapped in tissue, was the largest surviving piece of his grandfather's violin, the curved section from the body, the faint outline of his initials still visible beneath the worn varnish. Ethan's breath caught, his fingers trembling as he traced the familiar grain. "I asked them to keep what they could," Laura explained, her voice steady but laced with quiet emotion. She turned slightly, and the shopkeeper carefully lifted a new violin from behind the counter. Unlike the others, this one was different. The wood was polished and new, yes, but embedded into the back, seamlessly crafted into the frame, was the salvaged piece from his grandfather's violin. It wasn't hidden or covered up. It stood out, imperfect and beautiful, a reminder of what was lost and what endured. The shopkeeper's hands were careful, reverent, as she handed it to Laura, who passed it to Ethan. Ethan's breath hitched, his fingers hovering over the instrument, afraid to touch it, afraid it might disappear like everything else. Laura's hand found his shoulder again, grounding him. "They can break the wood," she said softly, her voice warm with conviction. "But they can't break your music." Ethan's eyes burned, Not with fear or humiliation this time, but with something warmer, heavier, a knot of pride, memory, and hope tangled together. The shopkeeper set the violin in his hands, its weight light but solid, real. His bow, restrung and cleaned, waited beside it, gleaming under the shop's lights. Ethan tucked the instrument beneath his chin, the new wood cool against his skin, the familiar fragment warm against his chest. His fingers found the strings, shaky at first, but steadying as the bow met them. The first note wobbled, uncertain, echoing the fear of that day in the park. The second was stronger, clearer, carrying the memory of his grandfather's hands. The third soared, filling the quiet shop with a sound that was imperfect but full, rich with something no one, not the officers, not the crowd, not even broken wood, could touch. The melody was his grandfather's, their shared story woven into every note. Laura watched, her arms folded, her eyes sharp but soft at the edges now, the faintest trace of pride breaking through her calm. The shopkeeper stood quietly behind the counter, her hands clasped, listening as the music filled the space. Ethan didn't notice the door open at first, didn't see the young couple who paused in the doorway, drawn by the sound, their faces softening as they listened. He didn't notice the way the shop's warmth seemed to wrap around him, steadying his trembling hands. Outside, the afternoon light poured through the glass as they stepped onto the sidewalk of West 57th Street. The city hummed with noise, taxis honking, pedestrians rushing, the distant wail of a siren. But for the first time in days, it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt alive, like a rhythm he could join. Laura's hand rested on Ethan's back as they walked, her presence steady, unyielding. She broke the silence with a small, rare smile, her voice laced with quiet steel. "Next time you play," she said, "play like you own the whole damn park." Ethan's lips twitched into the smallest of smiles, the violin case warm in his grip, his grandfather's memory steady in his heart. The weight of the broken pieces, the judgment, the fear, they were still there, but they were lighter now, overshadowed by the music that refused to break. Because some songs, no matter how hard the world tries, they never break. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.